I do want to switch over to get back to Descartes. There's always this commentary note about that. And I wanted to ask you maybe to start off, but you can go in a different direction if you think it's more profitable, why Descartes? You've done 2 books on Descartes now. There's lots of other guys in that pantheon to look at, and there's lots of women to look at as well, right? So why Descartes? Why does he sort of stand out? What's grabbed you about him?
Well, I mean, what's interesting is when I first segued into the history of philosophy, I actually started off in medieval philosophy. I've written a few papers on William of Ockham and also Thomas Aquinas. And Descartes is, I think of as this transitional figure. So first of all, Descartes is historically incredibly important for contemporary philosophy, because many contemporary philosophical problems can be traced back to Descartes, and also the way in which we do philosophy, the philosophical method. It's very unlike anything that you would find in the medieval period. So he really is a transitional figure, methodologically, and also in terms of the kinds of issues that he raised. And also, oddly enough, given my background and training, he was a bit of an underdog, right? So, and I was sort of raised to think of Descartes as a somewhat dodgy figure in the history of philosophy, who had separated the mind and body, and insofar as women get aligned with the body and men get aligned with the mind, Descartes is the root of all our feminist evils. And I guess one of the reasons why I very much got interested in working on Descartes was I came to see that was largely a caricature of this view. And in fact, he's got an incredibly rich account of the integration of mental and bodily functions. It may all seem very quaint to us nowadays, but he's trying to work out essentially what we might think of nowadays as a sort of cognitive scientific approach. What is contributed, for example, by the brain and the body, and what's contributed by the mind, and how do they work together? So I became more interested in not so much his dualism, which is certainly there at a metaphysical level, you can't deny it, but his natural philosophy and his theory of human nature is one that has this highly integrated functions of mind and body. And, to just bring us up to, my kind of current interests, along with Jackie Broad at Monash University and Marguerite Delaurier at McGill University, our current project on early modern women and the foundation of thinking about equal rights in this very early modern period. Descartes is a major figure. Many of these early feminists, like Mary Astell, Pauline Delabarre, Sophia, and Mary Chudley, and so on, were inspired by Descartes because the emphasis on reason and will, and the account of generosity, which is a passion first and then a virtue, this account of virtue is very much an embodied sense of virtue. But it is focused around the use of reason and the will, and these women suddenly realised that the bodily differences did not make a difference to people's moral status, and so they used Cartesian philosophy to get feminism off the ground. And I think historically that's fascinating, and it's really fascinating to me to see how these women appropriated Cartesian philosophy for feminist ends. And we're talking here, the second half of the 17th century, so way before first wave feminism by a country mile.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that Descartes has, it might be just a misperception with, and you'll know better than me, being close to the action, but it seems like, you can name a number of very prominent historians of modern philosophy who are women who are also attracted to Descartes, apart from yourself, like Margaret Wilson, for example, or my former colleague Amy Schmieder as well. And
Lily Allen is a
that goes on.
Big
so it's kind of interesting. It seems like there's actually something in that. This sits well with my realist sensibilities, that people are actually responding to real properties in the world, like even if part of the world there is a text. And you go, yes, there's something in Descartes that opens up philosophical inquiry for all. I know that a lot of people have found like the cogito argument very empowering, and it opens their eyes to what's possible with philosophy and working things out from a foundational point of view or whatever as well. So there are different sorts of dimensions to that. I wanted to sort of finish up a little bit by coming to some of another aspect of your contemporary work. I know that together with Brian Key, you have this really interesting, relatively new, but not brand new project that takes you into topics like insect pain and plant sentience and you know, the minds of others that kind of touches on a little bit like that first session that we just had as well. So can you tell us a little bit more about that work?
Yes, so I found the first session fascinating because it is right up my alligator, as somebody might say, and I think one of the things that we're doing. So first of all, I've teamed up with Brian Key, who's a neuroscientist. In fact, he's the head of the lab Brain Growth and Regeneration at the University of Queensland, and one of the things that we're questioning there is we're working on the.
Yeah, I'll leave it.
You want to get on chat?
Sorry. We're working on the animal consciousness debate. And we're particularly interested in arguments that are used in comparative neurobiology around consciousness. And a lot of those, so the way that comparative, biology works is, comparative neurobiology works is that you start from, say, the human experience, because that's what, we can report. And you then try to sort of uncover the neural structures that undergird that experience, and then you sort of analogize out right to other species. So the way in which comparative neurobiology has worked with regard to an area like pain, and pain is a really important place to start, an important area to start with, because of its importance, we know more about pain neurobiologically than we do any other kind of conscious experience. So that's why it becomes, like a kind of paradigm example of the kind of reasoning that we're interested in. When following that principle that structure determines function, right? So we've got pain, it's got a certain function in us, we can report on it, and we look at the structures that undergird that in the brain. And that work's been going on since the late 19th century with great physiologists like C.S. Sherrington and later his student Wilder Penfield and so on. So there's a long tradition of looking for those structures that undergird conscious experience. And we start looking out and we can see similar structures, similar cortical structures all the way down the mammalian chain. But it's what happens, at that changeover between mammals and other kinds of species, these sort of very peripheral cases like fish and cephalopods and so on, and insects. And more recently, there's been this debate about whether plants feel pain or plants have consciousness and so on. And there the structures are very different, right? And there's a widespread assumption within philosophy of mind that we have to accept that minds or consciousness are multiply realizable, that they could be realized in very different kinds of structures. And we let our thought experiments go wild, and we allow that there could be Martians, whose bodies are filled with green goop, who have conscious experiences of pain and so on. And we're really questioning that assumption. We see, multiple realizability happening at the micro level and also at the macro level, but interestingly, there are just, many examples within comparative biology where despite, morphological or micro level differences, you get a very common design structure. And so we're really sort of bringing that observation back into the discussion about pain and questioning whether we can, in fact, analogize out to things like insects and plants and so on, and to draw conclusions about their capacity to feel pain or not, when we don't have that similarity of structure. And the other thing we think you have to kind of bear in mind is we have to be talking about the same thing, right? We can't just say, oh, pain is ambiguous, so pain in us looks different from pain in fish. We need to be able to keep the same sense of pain in play when we make those comparisons. Otherwise, we're just asking the question, we're just saying things like apples are like toasters, you know. Well, in
Yeah.
some sense, yes, but in many senses, no.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so
Yes.
that's what that project's about. It's really looking at all of the arguments that get used in debates about animal consciousness.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. Really interesting. Close to lots of my own sorts of interests, but that's neither here nor there, I guess, more generally. But in that work, you're clearly engaged in a fairly deep interdisciplinary collaboration with people in a range of different sciences to do with the brain and the mind and so on. In your work in critical thinking, you're alluding to work in psychology and the psychology of education and learning, and you're partnering with educational institutions, organizations there. And it sounds like in the history of philosophy work as well, there's a respect for the actual history that's going on as well, and people from different historical epochs as well there. So it's really, it's a really broad series of interdisciplinary connections that you're making through the way in which you think about philosophy, and also connecting up with how philosophy gets done sort of in the real world and its impacts. So I found it really fascinating. I'm sure students have to have this kind of insight from you about your own pathway in philosophy, as well as some of these particular sorts of more detailed areas. And you're just like a font of knowledge there.